live.
Hello. Hi, everybody, and welcome to Monday's This Is Not Therapy Hour. This live stream is brought to you by Effective Artistry, which is a neurodiversity affirming therapy practice based in Northbrook, Illinois. Hello, my name is Marie. I'm an executive functioning coach, and I am joined by Brandon Tessers, clinical director of Effective Artistry, and Caitlin Miller, who is a therapist at the practice. Hi, Brandon and Caitlin. Welcome. Hello.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. How are things?
Good.
It's unusually warm, which is kind of nice. I am enjoying it.
It's enjoyable.
It's enjoyable.
It's also connected to things that are concerning, but that doesn't make the experience of it less enjoyable.
Merely the isolated warm weather is enjoyable.
Yeah, it's been really sunny here the last few days. The daffodils still haven't come up, so I don't think spring has really sprung here yet, but I'm feeling the effect on my mood of more sunshine.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely noticing an impact, which is good.
I was like, I don't have to wear a super thick coat all the time.
That too, yeah. It's really nice to be able to shed a few layers.
It's actually a little darker here than it's been. There's like a cloud cover, even though it's warm, but we've had a lot of sun recently.
Yeah, way more so. That's a good point.
Anyway, good to be here. How are you?
Fine, thank you. If you're joining us for the first time, the This Is Not Therapy Hour is exactly as the title suggests. It's not therapy, but it's a chance for you to ask questions of two therapists from a practice that works not exclusively, but works a lot with neurodivergent clients, specializing in individual, couples, and family therapy. There are also a couple of coaches working at the practice, myself and Sarah. So the therapists can work with you if you're in the state of Illinois, and Sarah and I can work with you wherever you are in the world. If you'd like to know more, you can reach out to us at effectiveartistry.com. With the housekeeping out of the way, what's been on your mind this week? It's only Monday. What's been on your mind since last Monday?
A bunch of different things. For the first time ever, I threw together a last-minute happy hour on Friday. So
nice.
I and a couple of the other therapists here went out for a couple of drinks after work, which was enjoyable, but also unusual for me, and as with anything new and different, challenging. Mm-hmm. Also, I have been playing a game that I just finished this morning that was one of the most thought-provoking and moving pieces of art I've ever experienced. So I've been thinking a lot about that.
What game was that?
It's called Pentiment. It's a narrative, like, I don't know quite what you would call it. It's a narrative game. It's 99% of the game is just talking to people and choosing what you say in response to them saying what they're saying.
Are you sure you didn't secretly design this?
Yeah.
No, it really was quite an incredible experience. It's without getting into the details for anybody who might want to play it. It's set in the first half of the 16th century in a small town in the Holy Roman Empire, in what is now, Germany, as in Bavaria. And it's a very heavy on attention to detail and accurate historical representation of what life was like at that time. And it was a cool game.
Nice.
It was very cool. It's interesting. Not all games, there are lots of games that are very enjoyable and even have cool story, that you can appreciate them, or I can appreciate them in the way that I appreciate art. That even many of those games could have been a film or a book or whatever, that the form of it as being a game is not integral to this. Mm-hmm. This game was not that. And this is, there are games like that where the fact that it is a game and you are a player and the things that does play into what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And this game was very much that. It was great. That's on. I finished it this morning, so I've been thinking about that a lot this morning.
How long did it take to finish it?
I don't know because I play it in like, you know, interrupted sittings. You know, that I only have so much time and I kind of sneak it here and there, so I couldn't say. But if I had to guess, it was somewhere into like between 5 and 8 hours, maybe.
Okay. Yeah.
Which I couldn't say it's for everyone. It's a lot of reading and whatever, but
Yeah.
it was very enjoyable. Yeah.
What's it called again?
Pentiment.
Pentiment. I'm going to write that down.
Is that like an amalgamation of different words that I'm not tracking?
Not that I'm aware of. I actually haven't looked up what the word means, but I would assume it has some Latin meaning. The themes of the game, I mean, I don't know if I would say themes, but content of the game, it deals a lot with religion, spirit, like Christianity at the time and in that place especially. So I would guess that it has something to do. I don't know. I'm curious what pentiment means now. I would guess it's Latin.
To me, it sounds like kind of a combination of two words that existed. How do you spell it?
Pentiment.
Pentimento, the presence or emergence of earlier images, forms, or strokes that have been changed and painted over in painting.
That makes sense. I mean, I'm just, this is what was on
Sometimes the
my
English
mind.
form pentiment is used especially in older sources.
We can change to a different topic. Just let me know. But
That's cool.
there are different ways could talk about like the theme of the game, but definitely one of the major themes is how people kind of connect to the past and change the past and the power and the function of what stories are and how much accuracy in the story matters versus what function the story is meant to serve. And
That totally tracks because this is an underlying image in a painting, especially one that has become visible when the top layer of paint has turned transparent with age, providing evidence of revision by the artist. That sounds me similar to what you're just saying.
You play as an artist, and a major theme of the game is like you get to know this town very well and the characters in it, and you play in different, like, you know, I don't want to say too much.
But it's really cool.
But it is really cool. And a major theme of it is like exploring the ways in which old pagan traditions in the area were then kind of co-opted and changed by the Romans when they came and took over, which was then co-opted and changed again by the Christians when they took over, and like exploring that, to how we build on the past and modify things. And
so the pagans had the original painting, and then the Romans painted over the original painting, and then the Christians painted over the Romans painting of the pagans' painting.
In a sense, yeah. I mean, you hear different stories of the founding of the town that all play on similar themes, and another theme I would say of this game, which is,
oh my gosh, all art is iterative. It all tracks.
Yay!
Yeah, I mean,
it's a fractal.
All right, I'll just say, I still will endeavor not to like spoil things, but if you're interested in playing the game and having because some of what the experience was for me was not knowing even like the structure of the game, right? Like that a story beat might happen that I don't know, is this that, like, I didn't know. In fact, I didn't know if it was a game that takes an hour or two or a game that takes 20 hours, or so like a story beat can happen and I don't know if that's the end, or there's an arc and I don't know if that's the main arc of the game or whatever.
So like a choose your own adventure, you could go back and maybe there's another way to play it.
There is very much definitely another way to play it, and I probably won't go play it again, because to me, this is what I'm trying to say is, if you're interested in playing the game and having that experience of not knowing anything about it,
then
just stop paying attention to us right now because I'll say some things while still trying not to give away like plots. Because that's the thing is, like a movie or a book, what you're really wanting to avoid spoiling is the plot. Mm-hmm. And in this particular case, I don't think that's the, like, I think spoiling the plot for somebody of this game matters a lot less than spoiling the structure of the game. So, as an example, so I can stop talking so cryptically, is that you start out in, I think it's 1519 as this journeyman artist and blah, blah, blah. And there's a whole big arc involving like a murder and a mystery and whatever. And then at the end of that arc, which I didn't know if that was the whole game or whatever, at the end of that arc, there's like an interlude or two. And then all of a sudden it's 8 years later. And you are that same character coming back to that town for the first time in 8 years after having gone on, and you're now a master artist. And then there's another arc involving another murder and a mystery and whatever. And I don't know if that's the last of it. And that arc ends, and then all of a sudden there's some interludes and whatever, and now it's 18 years later, and you're playing as a different character that you knew as a child in the earlier one. You know, like,
wow.
It really, I think it would be, what to say? I don't know. Honestly, I'm just talking through this because I'm thinking about it a lot, and I want, like, you two are expressing some interest, and I'm kind of like talking about it the way I would discuss a book with a book club kind of thing. I do wonder how much of the experience would be different if you are not someone who plays video games. You know what I mean? Like how much of it, kind of like Game of Thrones. Did either of you watch Game of Thrones?
Yeah.
You did? Kind of like how some of the most like shocking and impactful moments in that really rely on you having an awareness of and an expectation for like tropes, especially fantasy story tropes and how they play out. You know, that spoilers for Game of Thrones, which is like an over a decade old thing at this point. But you know, that they very clearly establish, here's the hero of your story, the good guy fighting against the bad and whatever. And he gets captured, and every expectation that we've been trained to have is that he's going to escape or be freed, or, you know, like the question is never, will the good guy win? It's always you know, what exactly is going to happen? How does it work? But no, that dude straight up just executed like 3 episodes before the end of the first season, which is shocking to people. So there's some of that where, like, I don't know how much the experience relies on being, you know, having expectations around the tropes of video
There is
games.
a way that you're talking about it where I'm like, this seems like a video game for video gamers. Like, it's like, I don't know.
It might be. I mean, the major thing that I'm kind of, I guess, talking about, and again, still trying not to be too spoilery, but you expect, kind of the same with like a mystery show or book or whatever, like you expect to be able to solve the mystery, right? Like in a narrative like a film or a book, you expect that at some point, like part of the fun of reading books like that is trying, or watching shows like that is trying to figure out the mystery on your own. But even if you're not able to, by the end of it, you will be told the answer to the mystery. You know, that's kind of like part of the deal of signing on for an experience like that. So one of the things that this can do, because it's a video game, is, you don't know, like in the first 2 acts, each of which centers around a murder where somebody's falsely accused, or at least somebody is accused that you are positive is not guilty. And so then you get involved in like trying to investigate and figure out who did it. In both of those cases, there are multiple people that you can gather a bunch of evidence about. And at the end of the act, you have to say somebody. There isn't a choice to try and say like, well, I don't really know, or whatever. You know, like the dialogue options are, you select which of the people, but none of them do you gather enough evidence to actually know that they did it. There's plausible explanations and stories and whatever.
That sounds like such a Brandon game.
It felt terrible.
I think you should meet this person. I think we
Well, I
should
mean, there's a
become
whole
video
big-
game
whole big team.
consultants.
But I feel like that kind of ties in with coaching and therapy and the voyage of self-discovery that a lot of people find themselves on, and it never ends, right? And
Well,
you can never really truly understand somebody else's perspective.
I would say that's a major theme of the experience of playing the game, if not a theme of the
Not the
content
game.
discussed in the game. But
Yeah.
yes, you don't get the answer. Like, by shifting through time and having it be an integral part of what you're doing is getting to know different families and people throughout the town and seeing kids grow up and people die. And, you know, one of the things that just jumps into my head in playing the game is like, how do people go on, right? Like, after all this tragedy and all this suffering and this bleakness and this sense of inevitable doom that happens at least sometimes, like, how do people go on? And there is no answer to that question. It's just, they just do. You just do. And I do think that was a big part of the experience of playing the game, is like, there's not an answer. You don't get to wrap everything up and figure it all out. You just, stuff just happens. And the fact that it was set in a historical period, but also had a lot to do with investigating the history, like what at that time would already have been considered history. I don't know, it brings a certain perspective. But yes, the experience, like, I had a visceral experience of feeling guilty for effectively having someone executed for a crime that I don't know that they actually did. And I have noticed in my mind, like, that I am still, after playing, going back and thinking, like, who really did it? Was there a way? Because you can't do everything. You can't figure out everything. You know that there are things, like, you're presented with a timeline and a bunch of options, and you cannot do all the options in that timeline. So you know that you don't know everything. And it's a video game, but I felt bad about that character executed. And then 7 years later, the character that I'm playing is coming back and he's depressed. And a big part of what comes up in conversations is feeling guilt and doubt and uncertainty over his role in what happened 7 years earlier, including when people are saying things like, you solved the murder or whatever. And he's like, no, I just presented evidence. Like,
wow,
what happened from there is not on me, kind of stuff.
Sometimes, I don't know exactly how to put this into words, but I think about how I think sometimes human beings, like in a mass group of people, care more about the idea that something is resolved and an act of what they would consider resolution rather than accuracy. And I feel like there's something to, like, the human need to be like, oh, well, someone was executed, so that means the murder was solved, but to not look deeper into, well, was the murder actually solved? Was this...
Sure. Well, and that's represented in the game. Like, not every character is saying things like that. You know, like, some people feel confident about it. Some people are confident that you were wrong and you're a jerk. And of course, I made one choice about who to like suggest to the person trying the crime. And I could have chosen different people. So you get different stories and, you know, seeing, like, one of the characters that you can have put to death, which I didn't choose, is a father and a husband and whatever. And, like, having to talk to his widow and his children 7 years later, 8 years later about that would be an interesting experience that I didn't have because I picked somebody else. I think that sense of, like, incompleteness and a lack of resolution, like, and I think they actually did quite a wonderful job in following through on the basic promise of any narrative form of, like, providing an arc that has some resolution to it at the end, even though what they're trying to get across, I think, is that feeling of not being resolved, not knowing what happened, which I think they balanced very well to give some sense of, like, okay, the game is over now and I got some stuff, even though I still don't know. Even the, like, brief kind of cutscene that happens at the end, which it's a fairly common thing these days for games to have multiple endings based on the player's actions. And the majority of the time, the real only impact of that is that you'll see a cutscene that has like different, you know how like at the end of sometimes of a movie, sometimes they'll like freeze frame on a character, be like 20 years later, this person did, so that it'll just kind of switch like different slides or different whatever. And there is some of that here, but the way that it like at the end it shows basically like all these family trees and hints at some different things about what happened. But the sense of continuity of the people and the place that should, it made me think a lot about like, and again, I think this is part of the point, is that this is history, not to us experiencing it right now, but you know, history is never history to the people who are experiencing it. And you don't often have time in your day, like in your day-to-day life, to sit around and wonder about your place in history and how people will remember you and what will come next. And there was also good.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say we got some comments in the chat. Baston Cider, hello, says about Game of Thrones. I knew Jamie was secretly a good guy right away because he was dramatically bad, but we never got his perspective, and I was kind of disappointed when I was right. Qualified with I never finished the books or the series. Neither did I. I kind of checked out after book 2, but I did watch the series. Also, I'm going to pronounce this wrong. Hayao Miyazaki.
Miyazaki.
Hayao.
Hayao.
Thank you, Miyazaki. Just made a whole movie on that. I think that was in relation to what you were saying about.
You know about what movie they're saying. Miyazaki is
Studio Ghibli.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, Howl's Moving Castle and Kiki's Delivery Service, and very famous and great anime director.
G31, hello, says, I feel like part of that is just people trying to move on because you don't really want to know after having executed someone or put them in jail for a long time or whatever. And as Boston Cider says, it's the how do you live knowing what's happening.
No, I agree with both of with Boston Cider and G31. There is like, I mean, I think you were starting to say like how that comes up in therapy, or somebody, maybe you were saying that, Marie?
Marie was saying it comes up in like coaching and therapy.
That like we want answers to things, and you don't get them. And so the question of like, what is the point, or how do you keep going? There's not an answer to that, but you just do. People just do somehow keep going. And not to say that like that's some miracle or whatever. I'm not saying like, wow, I can't believe that people keep going even after things are terrible. More just, it's the mundanity of it to me is to embrace that is fascinating. That like, there's just a day and there's another day. There's a moment, there's another moment. You just like, that's what it is. And the striving for answers and for resolution and for improvement is part of what's happening in that time. And no matter what you accomplish 500 years later, anybody looking back at your life is still going to be like, wow, what a crappy life compared, you know, like the real meaningful improvements that you strive for and sacrifice for to make your community better, your children's lives better, that have actual meaningful results, all just gets blended together, and nobody has any idea of a distinction between before you were there and after. And I don't know, very fast. I could talk about this game for a long time, obviously.
I'm curious how that relates to the legacy you want to leave in the world, Brendan.
Well, I mean, I do think about things like that. According to the Ericksonian timeline, I'm not supposed to be into the, I'm close to entering the legacy versus, help me remember, do you remember?
I don't, but
Erik Erikson was I
think it's like legacy and then some version of like regret. Like people either like, I don't want to leave.
Erik Erikson was a theorist. He has on development, human development, like the same way that Freud has theories of like stages of development, whatever. There are others. And Erik Erikson, he framed his stages around conflicts, that like the central conflict of a certain phase of development, of, you know, attached to a phase of life, that like as a teen, the conflict.
Theory and legacy? No, that's a okay. Sorry.
As a teen, the conflict is identity formation versus despair, or versus isolation. It's kind of like what you're trying to accomplish, and then what happens if you fail to accomplish it. Intimacy versus isolation. That's the one for like the 20s. So the teen would be identity formation versus, is it despair?
First, trust versus mistrust. Second,
right. Newborns, trust versus
shame.
mistrust. Autonomy
3,
versus shame.
Initiative versus guilt. 4, industry versus inferiority. 5, identity versus confusion. 6, intimacy versus isolation. 7, generativity versus stagnation. 8, integrity versus despair.
Ooh.
None of them say legacy. So legacy must be a primary. Say the last few again.
Intimacy versus isolation is
That's
stage
like the
6.
20s.
Yeah, 18 to 40. Stage 7, 40 to 65. Generativity versus stagnation.
Generativity.
I think
That's where I'm at.
Legacy.
Yeah, generativity
Yeah.
versus stagnation is the like
I think
what
the
am I
example,
making? What am I doing to the world?
Mhm.
Am I just repeating the same thing over and over? You know, like. So yeah, I guess I'm entering that. But I think about legacy for sure, and that's part of what is so impactful about this game is to think like, oh man, so many thoughts have been coming up for me all day, and I don't know which ones to.
Boston Cider says, if you immediately compare him, Erickson, to Freud, just know that makes me immediately start to tune out.
Did you compare Erickson to Freud?
Well, I said that he has a model of development
Oh.
in the same way that Freud does, which I can understand. I like Erik Erikson's model a lot more than Freud. I don't really like Freud's theory of development at all. There are other things that Freud did that I like.
Mm-hmm.
Freud also gets a bad rap. He's one of those guys that later in his life, in the same way that like musicians and artists and whatever will often do, like later on they'll say my earlier work, you know, like I've learned so much and I've changed so much, but the earlier work is what everybody knows and thinks of you as. And he had a lot of the problems that I and others have with what we think of as Freud's work are problems he had with his work. And there's something to that, like all you can do is build on what exists, and whatever you build, whatever I build is flawed in ways that I don't understand. But if it's an improvement on what I was handed, then whoever gets handed what I've built will have the opportunity and the ability to find the flaws in it and improve on it. You know, that.
Does sometimes that make you afraid to make choices and do things?
No, I don't mind. To me, well, I mean, at least as far as my awareness of it, a big part of, as you know, a big part of my work is the whole like, yeah, you can't be right, but you got to do stuff anyway. If you wait around to feel like, no, I've definitely got the right answer, then you don't do anything. And also, I'm happy to, like, in the same way that I can be grateful to my parents, I know that what they were given by their parents, the way they were raised and whatever, that they worked their whole lives to improve and do better for me and give me better. And that doesn't mean that I can't look back and see all kinds of flaws and mistakes that I am improving on, or at least intending to, right? But yeah, of course, my children, or, you know, in the terms of career, my, you know, people that I teach, you know, like, of course they will find flaws and improve on the things. I don't have ego wrapped up in that, or at least I don't feel as though I do.
I'm thinking about like writing a book though, and that a book is a series of linguistic choices which are like kind of in some ways written in stone, and that I think sometimes you're afraid to write a book in that way. But without writing a book, then it wouldn't start a legacy in that specific domain of life, and so no one could build off of it.
Sure.
So this was sort of the theme of our extra long supervision session last week. Brandon and I ended up having a very long conversation about Yeah, worrying about the words being right, saying the right thing, having the impact you want to have, and how
Yeah.
it's not really possible to not hurt people, however unintentionally.
Well, and on theme with our conversations about art over the last couple of weeks and on theme with what I'm talking about, or part at least of what I'm talking about with this game, is you just do something. Like,
Yeah.
I thought that's what I mean about incorporating the mechanism of it being a video game, to put the player in a position where, unless you turn off the game and just don't play it anymore, you have to pick one of those people, and you cannot be confident because the game does not provide you the information or the opportunity to be confident. You just have to choose and go on. And
there's a part of me that's thinking, I wish there could have been an option of, well, because none of the people who potentially committed this, we can actually determine are guilty. We're not going to kill anyone.
Yeah, I wanted that option too. As a player, that's part of what I think is so skillful about the craftsmanship of the game, is that you are put in a position where you do want that, and it's not offered to you.
Yeah, and things like that, I can't exactly track what, but it reminds me of sometimes politics. I feel like a completely just random choice is made with a veneer of certainty, and then the whole public is supposed to say, okay, we're done with that phase of American history.
Well, I think that only happens in far retrospect, right? Like, only looking back on history can you say when one phase ends and another begins, which I think is part of, again, what I liked about this game is it's all muddier and more complicated than that. It's easy when you only know a very little bit about something to simplify it. Mm-hmm. But the more you learn about anything, the more clear it becomes that you just don't know. And you do something anyway, because there's not an option not to. And I don't mean in the sense of like, I don't mean like you just got to get out there and do what you can or what. I mean that literally, if you sit and stare at the wall, that is the thing you are doing. There's not an option to not do a thing. You just do your best.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of, to go back to last week, slightly, is I feel as though the amount of time I have pondered going back into music, I have cognitively thought that I was not making a choice, that I was considering a choice. And then I look back on 12 years and think, oh, that was a choice, because now all of a sudden I'm a therapist. Like, all of these things happened. I still have a body that's slowly decaying and limited
or growing.
Resources.
You could say growing. That's also a true thing to say.
Well, bodies decay after they reach peak development, and I think
your body, like, if you injure yourself, it heals, right? Like, your body is improving at the same time. You're not wrong, obviously, but man, we're getting real philosophical. To the extent that it's a choice, and I think it's debatable, depending on how you use that word, but to the extent that it's a choice, to me, I see the area where we have the most control, influence, choice, whatever, is in the language that we use. That's why I focus on it so much. And yes, it's an accurate thing to say that your body is decaying, or as people have sometimes said in attempts to be clever or artful, like, from the moment you're born, you are dying, right? Like, every moment is another moment closer to death. That's accurate. But is that but talking about it that way has a certain impact. Whereas,
but you haven't assumed your final form yet.
Sure. Well, I mean, honestly, yeah. You can be terrified of the future and you can be excited for the future. And either way, it's unknowable and not known.
Yeah.
The difference is in how you feel, and how you feel and what you think, they impact each other and they impact what you do. So I don't like it when people summarize things as like, you have a choice to be happy, just choose to be happy, kind of whatever. To me, it implies a control over the moment-to-moment emotional state that people don't have. That like when I am sad, I can't just be like, no, I'm going to be happy now and be happy. But in the sense that you have some control over what it is you focus on. You have some control over how you perceive things and how you remember things, specifically through the mechanism of language. I think there's truth to that.
I'm thinking about the idea of the artistic process being iterative and sharing things and taking up space and allowing yourself to be seen.
Yeah. I mean, to me, so obviously the word developmental is often used to refer to like what we were just talking about, like a stage of life or whatever. But another way to use the word developmental is to say this thing is an improvement on what existed, even though it is also flawed. That in theory, in this way of talking about things, there is not an option to skip from 1 to 30. You go from 1 to 2, and then from 2 to 3, and that my role, our role, whatever, is to take it from the number we were in, take it from 29 to 30, so that the next can take it from 30 to 31. Not to be perfect, not to be the end and be the person that like, oh, no one can ever improve on the things that I have done. Which there is an intrinsic desire for that, for perfection, because that's what perfect means, like etymologically. In addition to all the meaning it has for us, it also means complete, done, no further change.
Yeah.
And we are all grandiose in some ways, and that desire for perfection is one of those things. But being able to embrace, like, no, this is the best I can do, and either I, the future me, and or other people will learn how to do better by observing what I'm doing right now. Anyway. Cells are replenishing at a slower rate than they're dying, like my soul.
I can't read the comments.
I don't know that that's actually true. Maybe it is. Do you have fewer cells in your body as time goes on? That doesn't sound right to me.
I thought maybe certain cells replenished faster in certain parts of the body, but I don't know. Not a
But like
biologist.
over time, you don't have fewer cells.
Not a
Then you would get
physiologist.
smaller, right? Or you'd be more filled with air. I am literally vacuous.
There is that. There's a thought experiment in philosophy called the ship of Theseus, referring to Theseus was a Greek hero and his ship was preserved as like an artifact and whatever. And over the years, it would get damaged and they'd fix it. So a mast would break and they'd replace it with a new mast, and a sail would tear and they'd replace it with a new sail, until eventually it gets to a point where no part of the ship was present when it was used by Theseus. Every single element has been replaced over the years. And so then the question is that still the same ship? And the point of that, the thought experiment, is to talk about human change, that there's very little in terms of cognition and memory and value and whatever that you could say is the exact same about me as it was when I was 10 years old. Am I the same person? But another way to talk about it is the cells, the cells in our body, the ones that have the longest lifespan before dying and being replaced, is 7 years. So at any point, if you look back 7 years or further, not a single cell currently in your body was in your body at that point. Which is a fun. There's also the transporter thought experiment, referencing Star Trek, that the idea of a transporter, instantaneous teleportation, and that is that at one transporter, you are basically disintegrated. You're broken down into your component atoms, but also mapped. And then on the other end, that map is sent to the other machine, and you are reconstituted by atoms that exist on that end in exactly the same way that you were when
But
you
the map is not the territory.
Well, that's true, but a different reference. But that's the question: is that still you? It's exactly the same as you in all ways, except that the components are different. Is that still you?
Bass Insider says, poor bones.
Poor bones. Is that what, like, bones have less cells as you age?
I don't know, maybe it's just like in a transporter you're broken. Maybe.
I immediately went to
Oh,
bones.
Dr. Bones. Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Uh,
And I think he was terrified of being teleported for that reason. I think is the reference. Star Trek is not my deepest area of knowledge, unfortunately. My mom and my grandfather both loved it. Anyway, we're just meandering. I don't know that we have a point, which I guess is kind of the theme of some of what we're talking about. Here's something I was wondering as I was showering this morning. Meaning, like literally the concept of meaning. What we're talking about is a connection that is consciously and deliberately made between two things which are not inherently connected, right? That there is not an observable connection, so we just make up one. Like all words, when we say a word means, oh, there's some good questions. We'll get to it. Yeah. I'll finish that statement quickly and then we can look at those questions. Meaning is the connection between two things which are not inherently connected. I'll skip ahead. So in order to be like conscious, sentient, like the point of that is that you're making connections. You're establishing meaning. X means Y, right? And so I was wondering about, is it an inherent and universal thing then if you have that experience of connecting things to at some point wonder about what is the meaning of your own existence? What is the point of life and whatever? I was wondering if that's universal or if not everybody thinks about that. I would imagine that it's probably something that's universal, that the nature of making connections and being conscious means that, yes, inevitably you are going to try to make connections between you and your life and whatever it might be connected to, whatever it means in the grand scheme of things, whatever. Like this is.
I mean, it seems like the development of philosophy, spirituality, religion, all the different things is some version of every form of human society getting to that cognitive place and trying to figure out.
Well, yeah, I agree.
What are the questions? I can't see.
But I'm wondering, is it every single individual?
I don't know.
In those circumstances. Anyway.
Yeah, I was hearing you say that. I just was thinking the one thing we can say is that because it's existent.
So, I have two questions if you guys got time for them. A few weeks ago, we had a conversation about spiritual stuff, and I was wondering if Brandon could share what he believes about the existence of a higher power. And the other thing I wanted to ask you is, how do you actually know if you're neurodivergent? Great questions.
Very good questions. And the answers to both are related. I'll start with the second one. By my way of using the term, and other people, because like all language, it means different things to different people. So other people would give you a different answer. To me, how do you know if you're neurodivergent is like asking, how do you know if you're queer? Right? That there is not an objective metric that you can hold your experience up against to say definitively yes or no. To me, the question is the label useful to you? Is thinking of yourself and describing yourself as neurodivergent, is that useful to you? If so, it's a good label. And if not, then it's not a good label. I actually believe that about all diagnosis, that not that neurodivergence is the same as being diagnosed. There are some elements that are similar, but they're not the same thing. But in this field, we talk all the time about misdiagnosis or underdiagnosis, right? Mm-hmm. That someone can be diagnosed as borderline personality disorder, but then later on, another diagnostician will come to the conclusion of, no, you're bipolar. That borderline personality was a misdiagnosis. Yeah. Or that someone might not get diagnosed, right? That you can even go through a formal diagnostic process, a neuropsych evaluation or whatever, and still say, nope, there's no diagnosis here. And then later someone else can say, nope, they just missed it. You have ADHD and you always have, you were undiagnosed or whatever. So in the same way, like to me, those kinds of diagnostic labels are about utility. Is it useful to you? If so, then it's a good one. And if not, then it's a bad one. If it is not a useful label, if it is actively problematic, if it's more problematic than it is beneficial, then that's a misdiagnosis or a mislabeling or a misidentification. If it's useful, if it's more beneficial than it is harmful, then it's a good one. So that's my answer to that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I was thinking that I feel like something I've observed you do, and I'm curious your thoughts about this, Brandon, is that also utility is not stagnant and it can change over time. And so a label could be useful for you for X amount of time, but if at some point it loses utility, because I think some people, when they go into diagnosis, they think, oh, well, if this is useful to me now, that means I am this forever.
Yeah. And vice versa, people will think, now that I no longer agree with the diagnosis that I thought of myself as having earlier, that means I was wrong and I was dumb for thinking that.
Yeah, and that's like a really bad thing or something.
Specifically, I will have clients, I'll change details, but I'll have a client who will say something like, you know, I identified myself as an alcoholic at the age of such and such. And now I realize I am not an alcoholic, and I don't know, maybe I'm just addicted to labeling myself with different addictions and whatever. And it's like, was it useful to you? Thinking of yourself that way, did it lead you to actions, to thoughts, to feelings that were useful that led you on to the next thing? Could you have gotten to the place where you think of yourself as not being an alcoholic if you hadn't first gone to the place of thinking that you were one? Right? That, as I try to make the point a lot, these are not medical diagnoses. These are disorders, not diseases. It is up for debate. Literally, like two different diagnosticians could diagnose the same individual differently, even with the same observation of that individual. So,
but I think one of the problems that is kind of built into the medical system is that I feel like it's much more culturally acceptable for two diagnosticians to diagnose a person differently, even with the same data, but that if that person disagrees with the diagnosis, then that's not okay, and they just have to deal with it because of like the power differential.
Well, I mean, quite literally, your insurance company won't recognize a diagnosis because you say you have it.
Yeah.
But they will. Like, that's the point of having licensed.
But I think your example is really important because I think sometimes clients come into therapy thinking that because one diagnostician diagnosed a disorder, then that means that every diagnostician would diagnose that. And it's like so true, and it's always going to be true.
Yeah. And even the same diagnostician would diagnose you differently at different points in your life.
Yeah.
And I mean that including even on, like, you show up in it 4 hours later than you did, you'll be different than you were 4 hours earlier, and that could impact. You show up at a time when they are different. And
a huge thing too is how you narrate your life to yourself, because a lot of questions to figure out, did you experience this state that correlates with this disorder to this severity and this frequency for this amount of time, so then you can meet the criteria. You might say a year one day, and 2 years a different day, and 3 years, like it just, or moderate, or then.
Yeah, even official diagnoses are like, official diagnoses of disorders have official diagnostic criteria. You either meet that criteria or you don't. And if you do, you qualify for the diagnostic label. But those criteria are not clear. They have words all over the place, like that causes a significant impact, or, you know, a significant negative impact on functioning, whatever. You know, like, it's still kind of settled. When is a stack, you know, like, when does a pile become a pile? One piece of hay is not a pile, a million is. Where's the break point?
Well, and I've, for example, had autistic clients come in and say, I had no idea I was in burnout so hard for so long, and it was depression. And like, so I also think it's worth noting, and I think I've said this, but I don't know if I'm being clear, is like the self-report is part of diagnosis. And if you change your self-report, you also change what you could be diagnosed with, on top of the diagnostician, on top of the day, on top of their biases, on top of the...
Someday, when we have time for a longer conversation about all of this, there's a lot to talk about there that, with few exceptions, all diagnosis is based on self-report. of disorders, right? Like not
yeah.
medical.
Yeah, you can't like find something in blood and say no, it's not.
Right.
It's not in my blood.
If
but
you say that you are
absolutely
significantly depressed, you know, one of the criteria for major depressive disorder is feeling significantly sad most of the day, several days of the week for over 6 months. I don't remember the exact details,
I think it's 6 months, yeah.
Something like that.
Over.
And so, well, who's going to say you feel significantly sad? It's just you. There are a few things, and not coincidentally, the disorders that are most likely to be considered neurodivergent disorders, like autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, dyslexia, etc. There are some of those where we have created completely, I would say, inappropriately, and the DSM would also say inappropriately, we have created alternative methods of diagnosing those things that do not rely on self-report. There's a reason for that, and we can have a longer conversation about that. But yes, there are some where, no, we run a test, and it doesn't matter what you say. Our diagnostic depression is what then.
Well, and I had a friend do a neuropsych, and they met a bunch of criteria. I think it was for autism, and then their mom didn't have a report that matched whatever the neuropsych tester was looking for. And so it was like, you nearly met the criteria for autism spectrum disorder. However, there was not enough evidence to back up from your primary caregivers. And then that person was like, my mom barely knew me.
Yeah. Also, it has to do with before the age of 3 in the official diagnostic criteria. So if you're in your 30s, like how well do your parents remember 30 years ago?
Yeah.
We could have a long conversation about this. And I don't want to get us off track because the question was about neurodivergent, not diagnostic labels. So part of the answer to that is neurodiversity is a viewpoint, right? That at this point, people mostly use the language of neurodiversity and neurodivergence and whatever as identity labels, like terms like queer or shy or whatever, as a way of labeling differences in people. But the origin of it, the idea of it, neurodiversity is a worldview. It's a paradigm. It's a way of looking at things. And it's about the fact that everybody is different, and that among those differences are also neurological differences, and that you could not therefore make any determination about how a person's feeling, thinking, behaving in any way that's different from others without saying that at least part of that is possibly, if not definitively, attributable to the fact that their nervous system is different. Neurodivergent is a word that came across later, once people wanted to start having a way to be able to identify, I am different, especially it started in autism communities, as a way to identify, yes, I think this label does apply to me. There is something about me that's significantly different from the norm, but I don't think of it as a pathological thing, a deficit or an illness. And so that's where the concept of being neurodivergent came from. But truthfully, divergent, the word divergent, to diverge, just means how different you are from whatever you are diverging from. In this case, what we're talking about with neurodivergent is the norm, the statistical average. How much do you diverge from that? How different are you from the norm? Which again is an impossible thing to quantify or answer, which is why I come back to if it's a useful label to you, right? Because everybody diverges from the norm in different ways. So that's why the diagnosis got looped in, because if sometimes people just mean, how do I know if I'm autistic or have ADHD or whatever? And in those cases, there are diagnostic categories. But if we're just talking, there is no such thing as neurotypical. There are not two groups of people, neurotypical ones and neurodivergent ones.
Yeah.
But it is still useful to be able to identify, to use language, to be able to think about yourself and communicate about yourself. As for the other question.
The first question was, could you share what you believe about the existence of a higher power and how that
And the answer to that is...
to be continued.
We can talk about it more another time. It's complicated. But I'll say at least this, because I don't want to leave it completely hanging, is something that's come up a lot in my work lately with staff, as you know, Caitlin, but also with clients, is the idea that people can think, like you can have a thought that you also identify as being inaccurate, right? Like you can have a thought of, oh no, everybody hates me and I'm going to fail. And also look at that thought and say, like, I don't think that's true. I think that's just a thought I'm having. I think most likely my friends don't hate me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because of the limitations of language, it's difficult to talk about what is a thing that you believe to be accurate versus what is a thing that you think of all the possibilities seems to you to be the most likely one to be accurate, as opposed to what is a thought you have. All of those things we talk about by saying, I think, or I thought.
Mm-hmm.
And so when it comes to my belief in a higher power, or not, or whatever, a lot of it is about that. To me, in the way that I see things, and yes, I have thoughts about it. I think a lot and talk a lot about stuff like this. But to me, the conclusion that I'm at is it doesn't really matter. And I'm not really capable of figuring out what is accurate. So me sharing my thoughts on this is never about, here's what I think is true, or most of all the possibilities, here's the one that I find most likely to be true. It's always just, here's a thought that's interesting. It's not an evaluation of, because I find that to be pointless. Like, the whole point of conversations like this is that there aren't things you can point at to say, here's the proof that one is true or a different one is true. It's not a thing that can be known. So I think it's worth thinking about. I think exploring it is valuable. Coming up with ideas is valuable. Discussing those ideas, sharing things and debating things is all valuable. But to me, none of that equates to, here's the thing that I think is true. So effectively, I have lots of different thoughts about what might be the truth about, call it a higher power or whatever. And I'm not trying to be cagey. It's just time-wise. I'd be happy to get into more depth about what a lot of the, like, one thought that I have heard and that I like is some Judaic scholars believe that God, the reference to God in Jewish scripture, is a reference to the universe, meaning not like in the way that modern spiritual people will often say the universe wants as a substitute for saying God, right? But as a way of saying there theoretically exists a reality, right? There is a reality and things happen in that reality. And in order for me to do what I am doing right now in this moment, the history of reality, of all things which exist, must have all gone exactly the way that it did. Had any of it gone any differently, my experience right now would be different than it currently is. So in that sense, God is a shorthand for all of reality and everything that has happened. Mm-hmm. And that there are certain ways of thinking about and talking about God that if you think of it in that way, it's very useful, right? That God has a plan, or everything happens for a reason, or God cannot be known, or, you know, those kinds of things. In fact, a lot that came up in that game, a lot of things of like the unknowable mysteries of God, and you just got to kind of have faith and persevere and keep going, right? Like, again, to me, that's an encapsulation of just do your best. What else can you do? Mm-hmm. I think that's a fascinating topic or thought. And again, I'm not saying I think that is correct. Certainly, I'm not saying I think that's what the authors of those scriptures meant by that, although it's apparently possible according to some people who study that more than I do. But I think it's interesting and a helpful thought. I guess I could say I think unknowable things are unknowable, but it still is useful to me and interesting and valuable to me to evaluate what people might mean by those things, or why people might be interested in those things, or why people might come to the conclusions that they do. That it's not an evaluation of what is real, but it's still fascinating to think about why do people, you know, what do people mean by this version of talking about God or a higher power? Mm-hmm. You know, what is the function of that belief? What is it a response to? And so a lot of my thoughts in response to, is there a God or what is God, is really an answer to the question of what do you think people mean when they're talking about that?
Mm-hmm. Last Insider says, I've heard this, something about the translating of the word, quote, the word, unquote. I've thought about it a lot for gods in my D&D games. Boss Insider, I've seen your other comments. We might not have time to get to them about the limitations of self-reporting.
We already have time.
It's true. We need to wrap up. I appreciate the questions.
Is it a thing that we could do where we could copy and paste their comments and save them for the next stream?
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes people have really brilliant comments and we're not able, or enjoyable comments. Sorry, I'm trying to get joyous. Yeah.
Right now.
Yeah, Marie, if you would save some of that, because I would like to revisit some things when there's more time.
Yeah, and it's really fun to me to see what other people come up with when the three of us are talking. I
always enjoy talking with the two of you, but I enjoy doing the stream so much more when we're doing this not just for the three of us. The three of us can have a conversation whenever we want, right? Like the point of having it be a stream is that we're doing it like with art or whatever. We're doing it for theoretically an audience.
Yeah.
And to have some information about who that audience is and what they think and what they might be interested in makes it so much more enjoyable for me.
Exactly. Me too. Thank you for coming to the This Is Not Therapy.
One of my favorite quotes, I'm saying a comment. One of my favorite quotes is Brendan Lee Mulligan's, "You are the instrument for which the universe cares." I like that. Another one that I've heard, and I don't know where to attribute it, is "We are the universe observing itself." It talks a lot about the nature of what is it to observe? What is it to think that a thing means a thing? Anyway. Oh, please always ask. And
okay, I've managed to get those comments into a Google Doc, and I'll tidy them up, and we can.
There's a comment there saying, everyone says sometimes they don't ask because it seems like we're already having a good conversation, and please always ask.
Please ask always.
Really, one of the things I put the most effort into, like when I do presentations or whatever, is please interrupt me. I would much, much rather talk about the thing that is actually relevant, that's actually on your mind. No matter what else, the other stuff can be enjoyable. It won't be as enjoyable as the thing that's actually on someone's mind. But also, we'll save the question and get to it at a future time too. Yeah. Any way you do it is great. So thank you. Thank you, Bass Insider and G31. Thank you both for being here and for interacting with us. And anyone else who's here, thank you for that too.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you, Brandon.
Thank you, Marie. Okay. Well, I'll just thank you.
Thank you both.
I'm thinking about like
see you this time next week.
I forgot that I have to end it again.
Oh yeah.
See you all next week.
Bye everyone.
Goodbye.
Adios.